I'm going to finish up a little bit with Merton's life, say something about Martin Luther King, say something about Thich Nhat Hanh, read this final paragraph. I want to read something from St. Augustine. I've got other things. If it would help to kind of, well, I'll try to summarize things when we get to the end. Let me get through this and see if I can kind of tie things together. It's impossible to tie these kinds of things together, but if I could tie it together to where we're kind of satisfied, okay, that sounds kind of like I think what we were talking about. Let's sort of put it in a kind of sense that we can take, and this will have to occur to me because I'm at a loss for those closing words at this point. So Merton's life. Let's see where it kind of how it kind of goes and winds down. The 60s, as we left off, he's come from 1958 and the experience on the 4th and Walnut intersection, which they have a historical marker there. If you've ever been to Louisville, a bronze historic, Kentucky Historic Society has a marker on the corner. It's now a kind of business mall. The intersection is actually gone, but they left the marker in place where the intersection was. And it actually says on this historic marker, not a religious marker, that this was the site of Thomas Merton's 4th and Walnut experience, where he saw everybody shining like the sun. The flip side of this bronze historic marker stands about this high. It's got a quote from Merton on this. And the passage is in his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, which came out in the 60s. Though the experience was in the 50s, it's in his journal. He's got a 7-volume private journals, which are now in paperback, and these are very interesting to read. At the turn of the 60s decade, all of the, John F. Kennedy gets elected. We're starting to think about the moon, Cuban crisis, student unrest, women's liberation movement, the civil rights movement. The war is starting to beef up. Johnson's administration and the escalation of bombing, and then we're moving toward Nixon, and talk about upheaval. That decade was just as wild as it could be. Good wildness and bad wildness. But a lot of things were kind of open and thrown up, and you remember you don't trust anybody over 30, and everybody's kind of worried about structures and forms and tearing down the wall and revolutions. And well, Merton is a little at home with this, but people are wanting him to come out on the streets. They wanted him to be an activist. They wanted him to lend his authorial voice, his eloquence as a poet, because he's writing. I mean, he's got his collected book of poetry is that thick. It's tough stuff, though. It really is. It's not the greatest kind of poetry, but he's got a lot of jewels in there. But he was really a poet. He just loved being a poet. He loved what language kind of revealed and hid all at the same time. He was playful like that. But poets wanted him out, and poetry became very full of dissent and new ways of trying to protest and to say something, declare something. And so Merton became very valuable to a lot of people that wanted him to speak on their side of the issues as the country started to divide. He really didn't want to take positions. He took positions, but they weren't positions that were politically motivated or ideologically oriented. They were perceptions of social issues from a deeply contemplative spiritual perspective. His concern was with God's truth and God's life. Well, if you're concerned with that, you cannot condone racism. You can't have unequal schools, unequal pay, any kind of inequity, the inequality. This was just madness to someone like Merton, who did not have a social program for righting the ills of society. But I have to follow God, he said. And God didn't seem to be leading him into opposing camps. But he found himself in that. If you're a conservative and you read Merton in the 60s, you may not like him from a conservative perspective. If you're a liberal, you'll go, oh yeah, he was right all along. I tell you what. And there are people that like Merton. They've divided him up, as we do in modern thought. Some people like his pre-1960 writings. Those were really good. Now, that was holiness. That was some good writing. I didn't like that other stuff. Other people, he was kind of immature in those 50s. He hadn't really wisened up. The 60s is where his thought matures. And so you find people just kind of dicing him up and dividing him. This kind of happens at Merton conferences, where people have their Thomas Merton. It's not too bad. It kept me out of the Merton Society for years, though, fear that if I went to a Merton conference, everybody had Merton hats or caps and Merton t-shirts and souvenirs and pennants over here and then balloons over here, almost like a Republican Democratic political convention. But it wasn't. It was a room of people just like this. It was the best conference I'd ever been to in my life. It was the one in 2001, which was at Bellarmine. I literally cried 5 times during this conference because I was so moved at the communion and the peacefulness and the contemplative. I just hadn't seen a room of 400 people on that kind of wavelength before. And so when people said things, they really said something. They were not posturing. They weren't posing. And it was incredible. They had one singer who had an operatic voice. I'm not really a fan of opera. I'm open to it, but I wasn't a fan of it. But he sang, and it was a little too formal for me, but it was beautiful. He hit notes it was the beauty of those notes that just moved me. And it was just, there was this sense of being a part of something that's unexplainable. And I was just so relieved. It was like burdens off my shoulder to see this many people on the same wavelength about this kind of understanding of the spiritual faith in life. And then I was so, but for years before that, I would not go because I'd been to too many other religious conferences. They were just in commotion. They were just madness and people arguing and fighting. These were just completely something different. Something we're a little more used to these days, and contemplative outreach certainly it's helped us a great deal. So everybody's wanting Merton out in the streets, saying things. Along the way, Thich Nhat Hanh, who was exiled from Vietnam for being a Buddhist monk against the war in his country, he was exiled, as you know, he was found kind of residency in France where he's still at, Plum Village. There where he passed through the United States and he went to Gethsemane. And he met Thomas Merton, and Merton wrote a little piece on it. He said, Thich Nhat Hanh is my brother. And he says, I'm closer to him than I am to some of the brothers I've lived with for all these years. And he was just moved. We don't speak the same language, we're not the same religion, but he sensed a communion in the mid-60s with somebody, and he was ecstatic about the realization of the commonness that they had in spiritual communion, even though they're completely different language, cultures, religions, races. That prepared him for what his experience in the late 60s, 68, when he went to Asia and he spoke and talked about being, we're all one, but we think we're not. Now, Martin Luther King nominated Thich Nhat Hanh for the Nobel Peace Prize. Other people nominated Martin Luther King. But Martin Luther King met Thich Nhat Hanh and nominated him for the Peace Prize. Martin Luther King Jr. knew about Merton, and a Quaker woman by the name of June Youngblood in Atlanta knew Corianna Scott King, Martin's wife, and they were setting up, June and Corianna were setting up a meeting for Martin and Merton. And but this was 1968. And Martin Luther King Jr. had agreed to do this. As soon as he finished up with the sanitation strike workers in Memphis, which is where I'm from. And that's where he was assassinated. He was stressed out with his movement, with the agitation, the activism, the activity. He needed a retreat to save his soul. Merton understood peace. He understood nonviolence. He understood the black struggle at the time. He was almost like a counselor to people. And as I mentioned before, Joan Baez went thinking that the 60s and the folk music and the hippies would, if Merton would come out, everybody would just flock and we would kind of do this. We could accomplish this. But his place was not out there, and he didn't come to Memphis. King was going to come to Gethsemane, but then he was assassinated before he could come. A little later in the year, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. So it was a tough year. And then in December 68, this is when Merton dies. And a lot of people at the time thought that maybe his death notice was on the front page of the New York Times. So 1968 New York Times, they don't put death notices on the front page unless you are somebody at that point in time. And he was there. There's a lot of suspicion that something happened. It's maybe because he spoke out against the war, as some of these other people did, because he was for the black civil rights movement, and so on, that maybe someone assassinated. He came back to America on a SAC plane, Strategic Air Command Air Force plane that was filled with fallen American soldiers, flags on their caskets. And Merton came back in one of those unnamed soldiers' caskets. And people kind of wondered, did something happen to him? But I told you, he was electrocuted. The people at the Gethsemane really didn't have any suspicions. They didn't think anybody was trying to kill him. The FBI had a file on him, though. And you can do a Freedom of Information request and get the FBI's file on Merton. And there was a few Catholics in Kentucky that were very upset with Merton. And they wrote to Hoover and said, you got to do something about this guy. He's talking about this and that, and this is not what the church is for. So there was just in his county, Merton knew that there were other people who were upset with him. And the FBI was following like they're following you and me as well. I'm sure we all have a file there. We know the NSA reads our email and our text messages, and then they got our phones. They know where we've been, so we're all caught. But there's an FBI file, and there was still concern from the 50s of the Red Scare and communist, and so it was brittle political times, and people saying things, and inflammation was such an easy thing, and everybody was so upset. Those were volatile times. But here's a monk who's referring to this and talking about this, but he's talking about it in a contemplative way. If you read his writings on social issues in the 60s, you don't find some rabble-rousing people with the fist in the air. He's saying, contemplate God alone, and then live accordingly. And if you live like that, then you've got to be peace in the world.